Tonight, we begin with a development that European officials, banking insiders, and financial analysts have feared, dismissed, and quietly tracked for years. A development that unfolded not over generations of slow decay, but in just a few warning moments. Moments that exposed fragility. Moments that revealed denial. Moments that showed how close Europe already is to the edge. What Europe's financial architecture allowed to persist crossed a line that Brussels and Frankfurt had hoped would never be tested again. And when that line began to crack, the response came fast. Not with reform, not with honesty, but with containment, reassurance, and silence. For more than a decade now, there have been signals not from official press conferences, not from summit declarations, just persistent indicators that Europe's banking system was carrying something structural and unresolved. Europe's banks have been stabilized, yes, but they have also been propped up in that stabilization. Their behavior followed a familiar pattern, a cycle, almost a ritual: crisis, emergency support, temporary calm, deferred reform. But what set off alarm bells inside central banks, rating agencies, and regulatory circles recently was that the pattern went quiet. No reform announcements, no consolidation push, no structural cleanup. Experts who monitor capital buffers, sovereign exposure, non-performing loans, and liquidity stress know the indicators. Artificially suppressed risk, heavy sovereign bank interdependence, regulatory forbearance, and the sudden absence of urgency, all of that went quiet. And whenever a fragile system goes quiet, it means pressure is building. Earlier this year, European supervisory bodies and market observers detected what they described as a deterioration masked by stability, including exposure concentrations that had not been meaningfully reduced since the last crisis. These are the kinds of imbalances that only persist when policymakers are signaling one of three things: delay, denial, or political paralysis. Observers didn't know which category Europe had fallen into, or whether it had quietly slipped into all three. But what they did know was this: Europe's banking posture was no longer defensive. It was complacent. And when a system shifts from caution to complacency without explanation, authorities pay attention even if they don't admit it publicly. The warnings issued internally by European regulators and central banks were not routine. They were not symbolic. They were not public. They were urgent and private. Officials speaking after closed-door meetings described the situation as manageable, contained, and perhaps most importantly, politically inconvenient because it demands action no government wants to take. But crisis management strategies only work if the public remains calm, and so far, it has. In fact, Europe's response has been among the most disciplined displays of calm messaging seen since the euro crisis. Within days of new stress indicators, authorities issued reassurance, reaffirmed capital strength, downplayed systemic risk. These were not ordinary communications. They were confidence maintenance tools deployed when policymakers are buying time. Tonight, multiple financial sources confirm that Europe's response targeted symptoms, not causes. Liquidity backstops were reinforced. Supervisory flexibility expanded. Risk metrics quietly adjusted. In other words, authorities targeted market perception, not structural exposure. They moved before fear could spread. They stabilized signals, not balance sheets. This is what makes the silence so dangerous. Europe's banking problem is not a single institution. It is not a single country. It is the feedback loop between governments and banks. Banks hold sovereign debt. Governments depend on banks. Neither can fail, so neither can be reformed easily. The response was forceful, but not transformative, not reckless, not impulsive, but deferral by design. Here's where the story becomes even more unsettling. Analysts aligned with Varoufakis' long-standing critique believe Europe's strategy is not about stability. It is about avoiding political rupture. Europe wanted to see whether markets would remain calm without reform, whether voters would remain disengaged, whether the illusion of normality would hold. So far, it has. But that calm is misleading. Authorities didn't confront the problem. They absorbed it. and absorption only works until the next shock. That matters because it shows something critical. Europe is not passive. It is actively postponing reckoning. As reports continued coming in, the scale of Europe's quiet intervention became clearer. Central banks extended flexibility, preventing immediate stress. Regulators softened enforcement, avoiding forced corrections. Governments coordinated messaging to maintain confidence. This wasn't reform. This wasn't resolution. This was systemic delay. And delay is the one thing fragile systems rely on most until they can't. Remember, Europe believed the last crisis had been solved. The banking union was sufficient. The system was safer. But tonight, the opposite is becoming visible. Risks remain mutualized. Exposure remains concentrated. And reform remains incomplete. What makes this moment so dangerous and so politically sensitive is that Europe's banking vulnerability exists during maximum pressure. Inflation, energy costs, geopolitical instability, electoral volatility. Different factions want different outcomes. Some want discipline. Some want protection. Some want growth at any cost. Some want delay. And leaders balancing those demands don't act from strength. They act from fear of backlash. Official statements emphasize resilience and robust capitalization. That is institutional language for, we cannot open this debate right now. You don't hear that tone unless the cost of truth is judged too high. European leaders addressed their publics in measured, technical speeches. They spoke of safeguards. They spoke of vigilance. They spoke of confidence. These were not reform speeches. They were containment narratives. What makes the situation more concerning is that Europe's problem is not isolated. Alongside banking fragility, public debt remains elevated. Growth remains uneven. Political trust remains fragile. All within the same time frame. When multiple vulnerabilities align, shocks don't need to be large. They only need to arrive. Analysts now see three paths. One, Europe confronts the banking problem openly. Another, it muddles through until growth returns. A third, a new external shock forces action. Today, Europe chose delay. That option disappears under stress. What we are watching now is a test of credibility. Markets want reassurance. Citizens want stability. Institutions want time. But time is the one resource fragile systems never control. Sources say monitoring continues. They say stress indicators are manageable. They say intervention tools are ready. And they say Europe's strategy is not reform, but waiting. As the months ahead unfold, the truth will surface. Either through gradual reform or sudden shock. What we know now is this. Europe did not defuse its banking time bomb. It insulated it. It postponed it. What happens next depends on what hits first. And tonight, Europe appears calm. Markets are quiet, too quiet. And when fragile systems are quiet, it means stress is being absorbed, not removed. Because tonight, Europe learned something it has learned before. Delay feels safe. Silence feels stable, until it isn't. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The risk remains. The reckoning is delayed. And the next shock will not ask permission. And we will be here watching every signal. As that next phase unfolds.